Okay, let's unpack this. We hear so much about climate change. Rising temperatures, record greenhouse gas levels, real threats to our planet's ecosystems. And it all points to one huge, urgent challenge, transforming our energy systems away from fossil fuels towards something sustainable.
That's exactly the context set out right at the start of the source material we're digging into today. It really highlights the risks and frames the Paris Agreement as that critical moment when global policy started to really acknowledge fossil fuel emissions as a key cause and, well, the need for change.
Absolutely. And that leads directly to the big question this deep dive is designed to help you answer. Is a fully renewable, carbon-neutral electricity system even possible globally in the relatively near future, say, by 2050? And if it is, how do we actually build it without, massive disruption?
That's precisely what this study tackles head on. Our source for today is titled Radical Transformation Pathway Towards Sustainable Electricity via Evolutionary Steps. It uses some pretty sophisticated modeling to chart a potential course for the world's electricity system to become 100% renewable by 2050.
Right. So our mission for you is to break down this study, what it found, how they modeled this future, and what it really tells us about the practical path forward for global electricity based on the sources you provided.
Exactly. Let's start where the study does sort of laying out the problem and the starting point. It highlights the drivers for this transformation, the clear signs of a changing climate, threats like coral reef collapse, and the undeniable link to emissions.
And it looks back at the global electricity system in 2015 as its baseline, right?
Right.
What did that actually look like?
Yeah, so in 2015, fossil fuels were absolutely dominant, providing something like 65% of global electricity generation. Hydropower was the leading renewable back then, about 16%, but solar PV and wind were still quite small players, just 1.2% for solar and 4% for wind.
Hmm. But even back then, solar and wind were starting to grow incredibly fast, weren't they?
Oh, they really were. The study points out that solar PV in particular showed a phenomenal compound annual growth rate of like 48% between 2006 and 2016. Wind was also accelerating rapidly, growing around 21% annually in that same period. So while their share was small, the trajectory was already pretty steep.
Okay, so the growth was definitely there, but was the inherent potential of renewable resources globally even enough to replace all that fossil fuel power? Is there enough sun and wind?
Well, this is a really crucial finding of the study. Yes, the available renewable energy resources are more than abundant globally. They cite these huge technical potential figures like 87.5 to, well, a staggering 2,770 petawatt hours for solar PV and 23.6 to 161 for wind.
Petawatt hours. That sounds like a lot.
It is. I mean, just to give you a sense of scale, the entire world's annual electricity consumption right now is around, what, 25-30 p whale? So the resource is definitely there. And importantly, they note these resources are much more evenly distributed across the planet than fossil fuels are.
That's a key point. So how did the study actually model this transition from the 2015 system to a 100% renewable one? What was their approach?
They use a sophisticated tool called the LUT Energy System Transition Model. It's basically a global simulation that divides the world into 145 regions and runs calculations with hourly resolution for a full year. This detail lets them capture the, minute-by-minute variability of solar and wind and demand.
And the model tries to find the cheapest way to do it.
Exactly. The core objective is to find the minimum cost pathway to transition the system over time. It takes the 2015 system as its starting point and assumes existing fossil and nuclear plants operate until the end of their technical lifespan, but crucially, no new ones are built. The model then determines the least cost way to build out all the new capacity needed.
Okay. And the evolutionary steps concept in the title, what does that mean in terms of the model? Does it just assume everything changes overnight?
No, and that's important. It's about making the transition pathway realistic. The model doesn't assume you can just, instantly build infinite capacity. It limits the annual speed at which new renewable plants and infrastructure can be deployed, basing those limits on historical rates of how fast technologies have actually spread and been installed.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so this constrains the model to simulate a more gradual evolutionary transition rather than some sudden disruptive leap that might not be feasible in reality.
Got it. Makes sense. And what role does nuclear power play in this modeled future?
Well, in this specific analysis, nuclear energy isn't considered sustainable by the researchers for this particular model, so it doesn't build any new nuclear capacity. Existing nuclear power plants, however, do continue to operate in the model until they reach their technical end of life.
All right, let's fast forward then to the destination in this evolutionary journey. According to this study, what does the global electricity system actually look like in 2050?
So the headline finding is that a 100% carbon neutral, renewable energy-based electricity system is technically possible globally by 2050.
Okay, technically possible. But is it going to bankrupt us? That's always the big question, isn't it?
This is where it gets really interesting and maybe surprising for a lot of people listening. The study projects it can actually be economically feasible. The global average levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE, which is basically the total cost over the lifetime divided by the energy produced in
Oh,
this.
standard measure.
Exactly. That's projected to be 52 euros per megawatt hour in 2050. The range they found is about 45 to 58 euro MWH, depending on the specific region.
Wait a second. 52 euros. The study says the global average LCOE back in 2015 was 70 euro wagers. Are you saying the model projects that a completely renewable global electricity system could actually deliver power cheaper than the fossil fuel-dominated system of 2015?
That is exactly what the study projects. A fully transitioned, 100% renewable system globally, potentially at a lower average cost of electricity than we had less than a decade ago. That's a huge, potentially game-changing insight from this research.
Okay, wow. That is significant. So what combination of technologies gets us to that potentially cheaper, 100% renewable future? What's the mix look like?
The mix is just dominated by solar PV. According to the model, solar PV accounts for nearly 70%, 0% of total global electricity generation in 2050. Wind is the second largest source, providing around 18%.
70% solar.
Yeah. Hydropower's contribution increases modestly, maybe 25% overall increase, mostly from existing or already planned projects. Bioenergy and geothermal play important roles too, but they tend to be more regionally specific.
So that means a massive build-out of solar and wind capacity. The scale must be enormous.
Absolutely massive. To get to 70% of generation, solar PV capacity has to increase about 100 times compared to 2015 levels.
100 tons.
Yeah. And wind capacity grows about 8 times. The scale of deployment needed is just enormous, but the study deems it technically manageable within those evolutionary speed limits it applies.
And with that much variable solar and wind, I mean 70% solar, 18% wind, that's almost 90% variable. How does the system stay stable and reliable? What about when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing?
Ah, yes. This is where energy storage becomes utterly critical. The study finds that storage ends up supplying a really substantial chunk, 31% of the total electricity demand in 2050.
31% from storage alone. Okay. What kind of storage is key? Batteries? Something else?
It's really 2 main types. Battery storage is projected to be vital for covering those diurnal needs, the daily ups and downs in generation and demand, especially complementing solar PV's daytime output. The scale needed is huge, around 8 terawatts of power capacity and 48 terawatt hours of energy capacity globally.
48 terawatt hours. It's hard to even picture.
It really is. To put that 48 TWH in perspective, 1 terawatt hour could power maybe 100 million average U.S. homes for a day. So we're talking vast amounts just for the daily balancing. But then you also need seasonal storage.
Right, for longer periods, like winter.
Exactly. For seasonal storage, particularly in higher latitudes where sun and wind vary a lot between summer and winter, the study points to gas storage. Using biomethane and synthetic methane, essentially storing energy in chemical form as gas. The scale needed for this is projected to be around 1,000 terawatt hours of energy capacity.
1,000 TWH for seasonal needs. Wow.
Yeah, this allows the system to basically store surplus energy generated in the summer for use during the winter months when solar generation is lower.
That really highlights the systemic shift required. It's not just generation. Is the cost picture and the technology mix uniform across the globe, or are there big regional differences in this model?
Oh, there are significant regional variations, as you probably expect. The study's LCOE projections and the optimal system structures definitely differ. For example, Iceland, which is blessed with abundant dispatchable hydropower and geothermal, has the lowest projected LCOE. But then countries with maybe fewer natural renewable resources, like Belarus in the model, show higher costs.
So having lots of always-on renewables like hydro or geothermal helps keep costs down. That makes sense. What about regions that rely mostly on variable resources like solar and wind? Can they still achieve low costs?
Yeah, they can. Low costs are also achieved in regions rich in variable renewables, especially in the Sunbelt areas where solar potential is really high. These regions often have lower seasonal swings in demand too, which helps reduce the need for quite so much of that expensive long-term seasonal storage, contributing to lower overall system costs.
Interesting. And why do some developed countries like Germany, Japan, and Korea show up with higher projected costs in the study's model?
Well, the study suggests a couple of factors might be at play there. In Germany and Japan, the prevalence of rooftop solar, what they call PV prosumers, people generating your own power, can actually increase the need for grid-level storage to manage all those local surpluses and deficits, and that adds to system costs.
Ah, okay.
And for countries like Korea and Japan, high population density can limit the land available for really large-scale wind farms or solar fields. That affects the optimal mix and potentially increases costs. Societal acceptance of large projects, especially wind, is also mentioned as a factor that could influence costs if it slows down deployment.
Right, the social aspect.
Mhm.
Beyond just building the capacity, are there technical or material hurdles to a transition on this scale? Things like grid stability or needing rare materials for all these batteries and turbines?
The study did look into these potential issues. For grid stability, it notes that synthetic inertia, which is basically using clever electronics and power converters to mimic the stabilizing effect of old spinning generators, can address the loss of physical inertia from fossil plants.
Okay, so technically solvable.
That's the suggestion. Regarding materials, they considered the needs for batteries, turbines, all of it, and concluded there are no known material limitations that would actually prevent producing the required capacities globally. They do note, though, that societal acceptance and political will are potentially more uncertain and significant factors than material availability or technical grid challenges.
And land use. That always comes up.
Yeah, land use is considered too. The model assumes up to maybe 6% of suitable land area for PV, 4% for wind, and potentially increasing hydro capacity by 50%, though the study notes these are assumptions that need careful, real-world consideration.
Let's track the transition itself, those evolutionary steps from 2015 to 2050. How does the system actually transform over those decades according to the model?
Well, in the early steps, say the 2020s, which is right now the model shows wind and PV capacity growing at pretty similar rates. Interestingly, in regions with a lot of old fossil fuel power plants needing replacement, like parts of Eurasia, gas turbines might even be built temporarily.
Temporarily, why?
Just to quickly fill the capacity gap as old coal plants shut down before the much larger build-out of renewables really takes over later in the decade and beyond. It's like a bridging step in those specific cases.
Okay, and further into the transition, beyond 2030.
Well, beyond 2030, as the technology costs, especially for solar, continue to fall, solar PV really starts to dominate new capacity additions, particularly in those sunny regions. And storage becomes significantly more important after 2030, basically kicking in big time once variable renewables like solar and wind make up over 50% of the generation mix in most places.
How does the cost structure of electricity change as you make this transition? You said the overall cost might go down, but what are we paying for?
It changes dramatically. In the old fossil fuel-dominated system, fuel costs are obviously a huge part of the expense, but the study projects that fuel cost becomes almost negligible after 2035.
Right, sun and wind are free fuel.
Exactly. So the lion's share of the LCOE then shifts to the capital expenditures for building all the renewable plants and the storage facilities, plus the fixed operational costs, and especially the costs associated with that massive storage infrastructure we talked about.
What does this transition mean for greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector? How quickly do they fall?
The study projects a really rapid decline. Emissions could shrink by 90% by 2035. Getting to the final 100% carbon neutrality, getting rid of that last 10%, involves replacing those last remaining fossil fuel sources, which the study suggests are often the most challenging steps.
And what kind of investment is needed to pull off this global transformation? What's the price tag look like?
The total capital expenditure projected from 2015 to 2050 is estimated at around 22.5 trillion euros. There's a range, maybe 19 to 25.5 trillion, depending on assumptions. This averages out to roughly 650 billion euros per year globally over that 35-year period.
650 billion euros a year. How does that compare? Is that a manageable level of investment on a global scale?
Well, the study notes this is actually comparable to current global energy system investments, although total energy investment across all sectors was a bit higher a few years ago. So it's in the ballpark. However, there's a projected spike in required capital expenditures specifically in the 2020s.
A spike now.
Yeah, rising to around 900 billion euros per year in this decade.
Why the spike in the next few years?
The study identifies the 2020s as the most capital-intensive period because It's when the peak amount of old fossil fuel capacity, stuff built decades ago, needs to be decommissioned and replaced with new renewable capacity and storage. Regions heavily reliant on older fossil infrastructure face the biggest investment challenges during this decade.
So the pressure is really on now.
It really is, and the study gives a pretty strong warning here. Delaying the start of this accelerated transition just makes things harder. It exacerbates these issues, potentially leading to stranded assets, expensive fossil fuel plants that have to be shut down way before their planned lifetime, and creating distorted investment cycles for decades to come.
That makes sense. Any other costs factored in?
Yeah, they also add estimates for potential cost overruns, which they figure average around 6%, and the necessary grid reinforcements to handle all the distributed renewables, which they estimate could add another 10 to 15% to the total capital costs, varying by region.
Okay, so this study, Radical Transformation Pathway Towards Sustainable Electricity via Evolutionary Steps, paints a picture of a technically feasible, potentially cheaper, 100% renewable electricity future, built primarily on a massive scale-up of solar PV and energy storage. How does this stack up against other research in this area? Are others saying similar things?
The study does mention that its overall finding that a high or even a 100% renewable system is possible generally aligns with other research in the field, so it's not completely out of left field.
What makes this specific study stand out then, according to the authors?
They highlight a few things. Their use of that high-resolution hourly modeling across the globe, incorporating the very latest cost trends for renewable technologies which have been falling fast, and putting a really explicit focus on the critical, large-scale role of energy storage needed for system reliability. They really foreground the storage aspect.
Did they mention any limitations?
Yes, they're quite clear about that. It's primarily a techno-economic model. That means it focuses heavily on the technology and cost aspects. It doesn't deeply model social dynamics, political hurdles, or the complex ways technology diffusion actually happens in the real world, all of which are obviously significant factors for any massive transition like this.
Right. So, wrapping up this deep dive, the core takeaway from Radical Transformation Pathway Towards Sustainable Electricity via Evolutionary Steps is that from a techno-economic perspective, using these evolutionary deployment limits, a fully renewable global electricity system by 2050 is presented as achievable. And potentially, it could even lower overall electricity costs compared to today, driven mainly by massive solar PV and storage build-out.
That's the essence of their findings, yeah. And they specifically pinpoint the 2020s, this current decade, as the period with the steepest investment challenge, largely because of the need to replace that aging fossil fleet right now.
Which leaves us with a really compelling thought for you, our listener. Given this study says the most challenging period for investment and replacement is happening right now in the 2020s, what does that urgency truly mean for the policy and investment decisions being made today? And maybe more importantly, what could delaying that accelerated transition really end up costing us, not just in environmental terms, but potentially economically as well?